I want to bring in my panel, Labor's Ed Husic and Liberal MP Tim Wilson this afternoon. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Patricia.
Good to be on a politically balanced ABC panel.
Well, it is very. I'm stuck in the middle again. Tim Wilson, Michael McCormack has seen off a challenge from Barnaby Joyce, holding on, of course, to the Nationals' leadership. Of course, they're another political party, but they are actually your coalition partner in government. Today was meant to be about honouring the fire victims in Parliament. Do you acknowledge this wasn't a good look from your coalition partner?
I suspect they acknowledge it themselves. I don't think their desire was particularly to deal with it this way, but what has been done, and that's why as soon as it's over, the focus is rightly returned onto bushfire victims, the families, the communities that have been affected by the awful fires over this summer period. A number of members of Parliament now are making sure that they're giving speeches talking about the human stories, the families that have lost their homes, the small businesses that have lost customers, the communities that have lost much of both their physical and their emotional structures, and the need and necessity to rebuild. And the Prime Minister, I think, gave a very good speech talking about how today is not the day to talk about policy. As much as possible, the focus should be on the experiences people have had and what we need to do to make sure we rebuild as a community and a country.
Tim Wilson, Matt Canavan, who was a minister, he's resigned because he supported Barnaby Joyce. He went on Sky last night to say there haven't been enough people standing up for coal within the government. What's your response to this?
Well, you know, we're a government that supports primary industries, that supports jobs and jobs creation. That's a consistent view across the government, but we also need to make sure that we're building the jobs of the future. And that's where the government has been focused on making sure that we can support job creation for the future, for industries that either are being created or haven't been created yet. That's why we want we've delivered tax cuts to encourage investment into the future of the Australian economy. That's why we're making sure, and the Prime Minister's been very clear on this, that we evolve policy to make sure that we can respond to changing circumstances to build the future of the country.
Ed Husic, after the election, and I was speaking to your leader, Anthony Albanese, a little earlier, there was a pivot or a rethink about Labor's own emissions reduction targets and its environment policy. Since the bushfire emergency, there seems to be a different tone. Do you think there has been a shift in terms of how Australians view this issue?
Well, firstly, I would like to have a chance to comment on what's happened today. I mean, today was about commemorating, it was about respecting, it was about thanking those who'd fought the bushfires, and all we had was this disgraceful self-indulgence from the Nationals that turned this into a farce, leading into what was supposed to be a day that all sides of politics got together to talk about the very things that were just mentioned a few moments ago, about the human story of the bushfires. And we didn't have that because of the Nationals. And then you go into a coalition party room where some of the Nationals want to, including Barnaby Joyce, again, defy community sentiment and the concern that is palpable and real, that climate change is having an impact on people's living environments, it's impacting on their ability to survive in their areas and having real life consequences, life and death consequences on people. And they still want to maintain that nothing should be done, very little should be done on this. And I think this, you know, people are saying loud and clear, as they have for quite some time, that we should be, one, taking climate change seriously, and two, doing what we can to reduce emissions and to play a part as a nation in tackling this issue. And I just think what we saw today, as I said before, was utterly disgraceful self-indulgence by the Nationals.
Tim Wilson, there were Nationals who stood up and challenged the party today in the joint party room on this issue around climate change policy. Clearly there are tensions between some Liberal Party MPs and the National Party on this issue. What's your message on this? I mean, is this the time to be retreating on this issue?
Well, I don't talk about what happens in the party room, but I'm happy to...
I'm asking what your view is on the issue.
No, I know. Well, I'm giving my answer. I don't talk about issues inside the party room, but I also am quite relaxed about saying what I got up and said in the party room, since it's important to confirm. And, you know, I think where most members are, and certainly what I've said, is that we agree with the Prime Minister's approach around evolving policy to address the challenges of making sure we create the jobs of the 21st century. We give security to those people who are currently in jobs, but also that we confront the challenges of a changing climate, emissions reduction, consistent with our election policies. I mean, we took to the last election a policy platform to cut emissions by 26 to 28% off 2005 levels by 2030. We're only, you know, if you want to get into the technicalities of it, only really a month into the first commitment period of the current emissions reduction regime, and we're progressively going to be cutting emissions over the cycle, and that's where I think most MPs are, which is to take a pragmatic, sensible approach that takes the whole of the Australian community with us.
How about Kyoto
can I just ask
carryover?
How is the coalition cutting emissions? No one can really point from the coalition about what they're doing to reduce emissions. They talk about it, they say they'll beat it.
Mate, I'd love to talk about our policies. So we're reinvesting in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We're making sure that we increase the amount of renewable energy, particularly through hydropower. We're also...
My viewers deserve not to hear a list. The question is much more substantive, I think. No, it's a question really about the National Energy Guarantee was, of course, abandoned. As you know, Tim Wilson, there is a discussion. I was going to ask a very specific question about Kyoto carryover credits. Do you think they should be used?
Well, firstly, I'm sorry, I just utterly reject this proposition. They say, what are you doing? Then you give an answer to the question, and then you say your view is to meld in a list.
Well,
if people want to know the answer, if you can't ask, if you want to ask questions,
specific.
I'm happy to get to that. I'm happy to get to that. But it's just absurd the number of times that as soon as that proposition is put out there, and then Ed says he doesn't think there's any answer, then you give an answer, then the response from the host politely is to say that they don't want to hear a list of the things the government's actually doing. We're getting on with the job of reducing our emissions. Now, I don't think we're going to need to use our Kyoto carryover credits, but I just think the whole argument, personally, about Kyoto carryover credits is frankly absurd. Carryover credits were a condition that the Labor Party put in terms of negotiations for the Paris Agreement. Then in addition to that, the whole point of carryover credits is actually to encourage countries to take action earlier than they commit internationally, because it means there's actually value and incentive to do so. Removing carryover credits is actually an argument for governments to invest in less emissions reduction or to delay it until you get into different commitment periods. It's actually the most bizarre logic I think I've heard, but in the end, I don't think we're going to need to use them. I think we're going to be in a position where we're going to be able to cut our emissions consistent with our international obligations. But as I've said, if people want to delay and encourage countries not to take action by scrapping carryover credits, then all they're doing is saying that for accounting purposes, they would rather countries did less.
Ed Husic, the Prime Minister has written to state and territory leaders proposing former Defence Chief Mark Binskin lead a royal commission into Australia's bushfire disaster. New South Wales and Victoria have both announced their own inquiries. Do you think there needs to be a royal commission?
My personal view is that I think there is probably a view amongst many in the community that the government announcing a royal commission that would, for many people, give the appearance that it's to look at states, and particularly around, you've seen a number of comments about, you know, whether or not there was enough hazard reduction effort being made by state governments, by sort of nudging the blame over to states about what's gone on when we've had a very slow response out of the federal government in dealing with the enormity of the bushfire impact on communities across the country. And so I'm very concerned that it's mainly a finger-pointing or a blame-shifting exercise at the federal level and is not a genuine attempt to see what needs to be done. And the other thing that I'm really uncomfortable with is seeing these two words emerge more and more in the aftermath of the bushfires, where you see a response that focuses on resilience and adaptation. Resilience and adaptation continually referenced, that we've got to now be more resilient and adapt to climate change, which is effectively a conservative argument about it's too late to do anything about climate change now, let's just deal with the after effects, which I think is disgraceful. I don't think that people in the community, if you ask them what the federal government was doing on reducing emissions, very few people can argue what is being done. They can't point to things that the government is doing. They're claiming that things will happen. They're relying on carryover credits that were largely earned as a result of the emissions reduction approach taken by a Labor government years earlier, but there is absolutely nothing that they can point to. They used to do direct action. That was a lemon of a policy. And now all we get is we're doing emissions reduction, but they can't really tell you what they're doing other than pointing to re-injecting funds into the Clean Energy Financing Corporation, which was something Labor set up, they wanted to get rid of, and now they've had to re-embrace.
Tim Wilson, I'll give you a right of reply to that.
Well, where does one begin? I started going through it before, but you just told me before you do on a list, but we can talk about the reinvestment in Snowy Hydro scheme to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through the expansion of renewable energy, the opportunity to look at Marinus Link, to look at surplus waste, hydropower that's to connect into the Australian mainland, the investment we've made in the Emissions Reduction Fund to see in the non-energy sector how we're going to reduce emissions. The government has a holistic approach which deals with mitigation, but also deals with resilience and adaptation. I've just heard the remarks from Ed there, where, I mean, it's just simply absurd. Australia is a small percentage of global emissions, so even if we reduce ours tomorrow...
was abandoned. You can keep talking over me, but I just want to ask this question. The point being made is that after the abandonment of the National Energy Guarantee, there is no national mechanism for reducing emissions. There are, as you've listed, some programs to try and reduce emissions, but industry has even been critical that there is not a mechanism built into the system.
Well, I would actually disagree with that, because what we're actually doing is going sector by sector to deal with the issues around emissions reduction in different parts of the country and with different sectors. Agriculture needs a different mechanism from energy. Land use management needs a different mechanism from agriculture. And so we're going through and establishing the pillars in different sectors to make sure that we can deal with reducing emissions across the whole of the economy. It's not just a discussion around energy. And one of the disappointing things is that Ed there has just outlined or made the argument that he doesn't think things like adaptation are important and resilience are important. They're extremely important.
Don't twist my words.
When it comes down to it, Australia is a small part of global emissions. That's not an argument to act.
I mean,
the key point is that even if we reduced our emissions to zero tomorrow, we would still be dealing with the consequences of a changing climate. So we have to make sure that we make communities resilient.
Okay.
We make sure we assist in adaptation.
Where the Liberal Party basically gets to speak the whole time. If it's not on Q&A, it's on here.
Thank you so much for joining me, to both of you.
Excellent.
Nothing's changed. Labor MP Ed Husic there and Liberal MP Tim Wilson, and I don't know, they must have had a bad day.